Nintendo rigid market control and security chip bypass. As an aside, few people seem to realize that Nintendo of America, Europe, and Japan are all originated from Nintendo of Japan, which was a gambling pachinko machine manufacturer and distributor, as well as a gambling establishment operator. Nintendo allegedly had ties with the Japanese Yakuza, or better known as ninjas, which is why Nintendo headquarters remains in the city of Kyoto in Japan, which is also known as the capital of modern-day Yakuza. Dealing with Nintendo was as much dealing with layered Japanese cultures and hierarchies and obtuse, inflexible policies as it was dealing with Nintendo technologies, variable controllers, configurable read-only memory or ROMs, and saved game RAM, and configurable multi-memory bank switchable chips. There was a lot to deal with Nintendo from a tech perspective, but I found their corporate and employee attitude was extremely harsh and had a "they are superior to everyone else" attitude. Whenever things were not clear and by the book, things were deferred to the Japanese director in the office. Sometimes the in-office Japanese director would not need to decide something, though. That was usually because an identical situation had come before, and so people knew what that director's decision would be. When new problems happened, however, and they went to the Japanese director, the issues would unerringly be delayed for over 24 hours. Usually so that that director could have a consultation with people in Japan itself. He needed to talk to a foreign counterpart so that the corporate and foreign counterparts were aligned before the director would make a statement and a decision. The consequence of the remote direction and rigid policies was that companies grew to hate and despise Nintendo. But the NES console from Nintendo was selling crazy everywhere, and so companies compromised their ethics and beliefs just to get in on the mad selling opportunities and action that was going on with Nintendo. It did make companies and individuals rich. There were initiatives to convince Nintendo to change their policies or prices, or ultimately may face litigation and antitrust laws from the FTC. But Nintendo held firm, and they hired more and more lawyers to defend their royalty method with publishers. Nintendo vowed to fight and crush opposition before they would kowtow to these pirates and thieves of their technology. Nintendo's views were contrary to the game makers. They felt that they created the games on their own and they should earn the money that they earned. But Nintendo felt, "You're shipping your game on our platform. We made the console, so we deserve at least 30% or a third of anything you make." Nintendo argued that game makers had no place to make or sell their games were it not for the NES console, and so they owed Nintendo for creating the very platform that could make them money in the first place. And Nintendo provided licensed developer documentation on how things worked. And of course, the security chip they made was not provided. It was only part of their manufacturing process. So they were buying that. Nintendo was the first video game console platform maker to demand a third royalty from every game sold. Everybody does it now. Google, Apple, you name them. Xbox, Sony, they all do the same thing. But then Nintendo justified demanding a fee for licensing their bare bones how-to documentation and for their security chip. And of course, the publishers paid the full royalty up front, as if every copy was sold, regardless if they ever had to mark it down or never sell it at all. Nintendo took no risk. They made all the money. To keep control from people that might not agree with Nintendo's licensing policies, they had their security chip, that was built into the cartridges and into the consoles. They would handshake with each other, and if they did not, they would block each other from running. So games had to be built with Nintendo's security chip to run on the Nintendo console. Every NES game cartridge contained one or more read-only chips that contained game code and images and sound. It was all formatted to work natively with the machine. Microprocessors like the 6502 CPU, which was in the NES, had limited ranges of memory, so the programs could only be so big. Every NES also contained a bank switching chip that allowed you to switch in more memory so that you could actually use larger game images than the actual console could ordinarily use. Every Nintendo Entertainment System console also contained that broadcaster security chip. It continuously generated a pseudo-random number. The pseudo-random number is not random at all. They are just a list of numbers that seem to have no relationship to each other. They appear random. But in fact, they are a repeating series of numbers based on one originating number, called a random seed. It's just a mathematical equation that is run on the results of the equation perpetually. You plug in 4 into the number. It generates a random range 1 to 4. It generates 3. That generates a number that you're going to plug into the next random number, thereby making it different. The idea is the starting number changes the entire sequence of numbers that it generates. It's complicated. Any company that contemplated making their own video game cartridges would need to bypass that complicated security system. It was very difficult. This will sound really complex, but I'm going to put it out there quickly. The video game cartridges in the NES generated a random 16-bit integer number that's 0 through 65,535 as a starting seed for its pseudo-random number generator, which existed on the game cartridge and on the NES console. On power-up, the Nintendo console sent a starting seed to the game cartridge. It was random, and the game cartridge would then start generating its random numbers from the same seed. The two would look to see when they matched up and then continually run to see that a long range of random numbers were synchronized. Once they were, it stayed synchronized continuously, and while it did, the game would run. That simple. If, however, it did not have the symbol, did not have the signal available, it would do what they call an NMI, a non-maskable interrupt to the CPU, basically stopping the entire machine dead in its tracks. Nintendo did not tolerate pirate cartridges, or anyone not paying their manufacturing royalty fee, and so they went to great lengths to protect what many considered to be a racket. The probability of someone coming up with a random algorithm that could generate the exact same sequence of numbers would nearly be impossible, or so Nintendo thought. Tengen released a few games under Nintendo's security chip constraints, but decided that it had roots in manufacturing electronics and massive game cartridges in the form of custom coin-operated arcade games. To support coin-op games and their manufacturing, Atari Games had a full electronics assembly line with conveyor belts, robotics, huge wave soldering machines, cabinet wood crafting and shaping machines, metal crafting tools, all sorts of things, art and decal printers, and ultimately final retail unit integration and testing. It was like walking into a science fiction set, seeing so many diverse manufacturing processes interconnected in one huge warehouse. Atari had a full-service end-to-end solution to build just about anything electronic or plastic or wood or even metal. Tengen intended to bypass the Nintendo security chip and create their own bespoke home video game manufacturing lines. But first, they had to figure out how to overcome Nintendo's security chip.